We had a Radio Shack computer, and we ended up numbering everything, punch it up on the computer, tell me what was on it.
Known as the happiest guitar shredder to ever touch a stage, Eddie Van Halen lit up the world for decades with his wild riffs, off-the-wall energy, and that huge grin everyone adored. But behind that famous smile, a storm was brewing he kept locked away. At 62, Eddie finally spilled a secret he'd hidden for years, a private blacklist of 6 rock icons the world thought he loved, but deep down, he couldn't stand. These weren't random names either. These were legends who once inspired him, jammed beside him, and helped shape the sound that made him a legend. But somewhere along the line, things got ugly. They turned their backs on him, dismissed him, or hit him right where it hurt most. And when the truth finally slipped out, the rock world lost its mind. So get ready for this, because things are about to get wild. Eric Clapton, the idol who broke Eddie's heart. First on Eddie Van Halen's secret hate list was the name no one ever expected, Eric Clapton. Yeah, that Clapton, the same guitar god Eddie once worshipped so hard he wore out his cream vinyls from playing them non-stop. Friends said you couldn't step foot in Eddie's room without hearing Crossroads blasting till the walls shook like thunder. Eddie didn't just admire Clapton. He studied him like a religion. Every solo, every lick, every tone, Clapton was his whole blueprint. But everything flipped upside down in 1980 when Clapton did an interview that crushed Eddie's spirit. A reporter asked what he thought about Eddie's playing. Now Clapton could have thrown him a kind word, even a small nod of respect. Instead, he dropped a line that hit Eddie straight in the heart, saying, "He's very good, technically, but I don't hear much soul." When Eddie saw that quote, it was like someone pulled the plug on his world. People close to him said his face went blank. No shouting, no anger, just pure heartbreak. He told his friends, "I learned everything from him." And he says that. That line echoed in his head for years. But the real heartbreak hit later, backstage in Los Angeles. Eddie finally met his idol face to face, nervous, thrilled, living his dream. But when Clapton walked in, the vibe was ice cold. No smile, no warmth, just him checking his watch like he couldn't wait to bounce. Eddie walked away whispering, "I think he just wanted it to end." That moment crushed him completely. The man he'd worshipped for years turned out distant, detached, like he didn't even care. Years later, Eddie finally opened up about that night and said, "I loved the myth more than the man." And that's exactly why Eric Clapton ended up at the top of Eddie's secret blacklist. Not because of any public beef or wild feud, but because that heartbreak cut deeper than any guitar string ever could. Richie Blackmore, the stare that froze the room. Eddie Van Halen never forgave Richie Blackmore, and the wildest part? Blackmore didn't even need to say a word. The first time they crossed paths, the whole room went stiff, like someone pulled the plug and the air turned to ice. The energy dropped so fast, even the amps seemed to go quiet. Eddie walked in buzzing, excited to finally meet one of his biggest guitar heroes. But the second their eyes locked, everything changed. Richie stood still, arms crossed, stone-faced, shooting Eddie a look that screamed, "You don't belong here." Eddie talked about that moment years later, still sounding stunned. "He just stared at me, didn't say hi, nothing," he said. That cold, silent glare hit harder than any insult ever could. Eddie was known for his bright spirit, always smiling, cracking jokes, lifting up the vibe wherever he went. But Richie, he gave him absolutely nothing. No handshake, no nod, no good to meet you. Just dead silence and a stare sharp enough to cut glass. It was like a slap to the face right in front of everyone standing there, too afraid to even breathe. And it didn't stop there. At a late 70s festival, a stage tech tried to lighten the mood, suggesting the two guitar gods should chat about tone. But Richie didn't even pretend to care. He just turned his back and muttered in a cold, low voice, "Not now. I don't have time for that kid." Eddie heard it clear as day. So did everyone else. The whole place froze, and the tension hung thick in the air like smoke after a fire. Then, just when you thought it couldn't get frostier, Blackmore took another jab in the press. When a magazine asked him about Eddie's explosive guitar style, he brushed it off with a smirk and said, "He's a fine player, but too many notes." That wasn't a compliment. That was shade, a subtle way of saying, "Stay in your lane, kid." From that moment on, Eddie's tone changed every time Blackmore's name came up. That admiration from his younger days, gone. What replaced it was quiet bitterness, a cold resentment that never fully melted away. Years later, Eddie summed it up perfectly with one chilling line. "Some people give you the shaft with their eyes." Then he half laughed and added, "Blackmore didn't just give it, he perfected it." Joe Perry, the rock star who acted like Eddie didn't exist. Now this one, straight up ice cold. The story between Eddie Van Halen and Joe Perry might be the most awkward of them all. Before they even spoke, the tension between them was thick enough to slice through. Eddie joined the 1978 tour beyond pumped, ready to share the stage with Aerosmith, one of the bands he grew up idolizing. But the second he hit backstage, something felt off. Every time he passed Joe Perry in the hallway, the guy just walked straight by. No eye contact, no nod, not even a half smile. It was like Eddie was invisible. Eddie didn't hide how much it stung. He said straight up, "Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with his eyes." That silent stare said everything, and it burned way worse than any insult. Not a "hey man," not a wave, not a single word. Eddie wasn't looking for praise, just some basic respect between rockers. But Joe Perry, he used silence like a weapon. And the coldest moment came one night after soundcheck. Eddie spotted the Gibson Joe was holding and walked over all smiles, just trying to talk gear and music. Before he could even say a word, Joe lifted his hand without even turning his head and motioned, "Don't talk." Then he just kept chatting with someone else, like Eddie wasn't even standing there. Eddie froze, completely humiliated in front of everyone. Later, he told a close friend, "It was like I didn't even exist." That one small gesture, a brush-off so casual, cut deep and stayed with him for years. And sure, much later, Joe Perry tried to smooth things over, calling Eddie a genius. But by then, the damage was done. That silence had already done its work, leaving a scar that no compliment could ever heal. That total lack of respect from Joe Perry stuck with Eddie for years. It haunted him every time he thought about that tour. With Joe, silence said more than any insult ever could. Randy Rhoads, the rival who hit Eddie right in the heart. The tension between Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads didn't build up slowly. It exploded the second Randy's name started showing up next to Eddie's in every rock magazine. Eddie had just changed the whole world of guitar. Nobody, and I mean nobody, sounded like him. But suddenly, here came this young, classically trained prodigy everyone was calling the next Eddie Van Halen. That title cut deep. Eddie couldn't hide how much it ticked him off. In one heated interview, he snapped, "He learned everything from me." To Eddie, it felt like the industry was already trying to snatch his crown and hand it to someone who hadn't paid the same dues. And even though Randy wasn't out there copying him, the media just wouldn't let the comparisons die. Every magazine headline, every fan debate, it all turned into an unspoken war for the throne of rock guitar. Their styles couldn't have been more different. Eddie was chaos and fire, wild emotion, pure instinct, and that electric edge that nobody could predict. Randy was the opposite: precision, discipline, clean technique, and a classical twist that gave his playing a whole other kind of power. But the press didn't care about the differences. They wanted drama. They hyped it like a duel, building this invisible rivalry between two guys who had never even shared a stage. Then came the moment that turned quiet tension into real bitterness. While Randy was on tour with Ozzy Osbourne, one of his crew members thought it'd be funny to tape a tiny photo of Eddie under Randy's wah pedal. So every time Randy hit it, he was literally stomping on Eddie's face. The crew cracked up, Randy laughed too, and the joke spread fast backstage. But when word got back to Eddie, he wasn't laughing. He kept calm in public, but inside, he was fuming. To him, that wasn't a harmless prank. It was straight-up disrespect. And Ozzy didn't exactly help the situation. Later, he mentioned that Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie. That one line made everything worse. Eddie felt like the same rock world that once crowned him a legend was now turning its back. Like they were swapping him out for a newer model. He went from the guy who changed the game to the one being compared, and that burned deep. But here's the twist. Randy was hurting from it too. The constant comparisons, the headlines, the pressure, they wore him down. Both Eddie and Randy hated being pitted against each other, but neither one wanted to admit it. Behind all the pride, they actually respected each other's talent, maybe even admired it, but ego kept their lips sealed. Then tragedy hit. When Randy's life was cut short in that awful plane accident, the rivalry didn't just end. It froze in time. It became a ghost that followed Eddie everywhere. No matter how many shows he played, no matter how many solos blew the roof off arenas, that shadow of Randy Rhoads lingered in the back of his mind. Tom Scholz, the engineer who crossed the line with Eddie. The bad blood between Eddie Van Halen and Tom Scholz from Boston didn't start behind closed doors. It exploded right in front of thousands of fans. Eddie had just ripped through one of his legendary solos, melting faces and sending the crowd into chaos. But minutes later, when Boston hit the stage, Tom Scholz launched into a solo that sounded way too familiar. Same rhythm, same tone, same fiery vibe. Eddie stood frozen at the side of the stage, staring in disbelief, like, did he really just copy my solo? When the show wrapped up, Eddie didn't hold back. He walked straight up to Scholz and asked, why'd you play my solo out there? Why take something that personal? Scholz didn't even blink. He just shrugged and said, it sounded good, before walking off like it was no big deal. That dismissive attitude hit Eddie like a slap in the face. To Eddie, this wasn't about someone borrowing a lick. It was about respect. Scholz acted like Eddie's sound was just another riff to recycle, like it had no meaning. That arrogance lit a fire in him. Eddie could handle competition. He thrived on it. But copying his solo and brushing it off, that crossed the line from rivalry to straight-up disrespect. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any colder, they did. At another concert they both played, Eddie decided to be the bigger man. He spotted Scholz backstage and gave him a polite nod, a quiet olive branch just trying to move on. But Scholz didn't even acknowledge him. Crew members swore they saw Scholz literally turn his head and walk the other way like Eddie wasn't even there. That was the final straw. Eddie could forgive a lot, bad vibes, even playful competition, but ignoring him like that, never. Tom Scholz didn't just borrow a solo. He acted like Eddie himself didn't exist. That's why Scholz's name stayed locked tight on Eddie's secret blacklist. Not because of the music, but because of that cold, casual disrespect that Eddie never forgot. Rick Derringer, the veteran who pushed Eddie past the edge. Rick Derringer holds one record no guitarist ever wanted, to be the only musician Eddie Van Halen ever kicked off a tour. And that alone tells you how bad things got. There was no slow build-up or hidden tension. This one blew up fast and loud. Here's the twist. Eddie actually liked Rick at first. He respected his older hits, his flashy confidence, and thought they'd get along great on tour. But that respect turned to frustration almost overnight. What started as professional admiration turned into straight hostility, and it all came crashing down during one unforgettable show. Eddie had grown up jamming to Rick Derringer's classic tunes, even studying his stage swagger. But once they shared the same lineup, things shifted. Rick's ego started clashing with Eddie's spotlight, and that's when it got ugly. The breaking point came during a live gig in 1978. Eddie had just finished one of his signature solos, the kind that made fans lose their minds, cheering so loud you could barely hear the amps. Minutes later, Rick stepped out for his set and played Eddie's solo, not inspired by it, note for note, the exact same solo in front of the same roaring audience. Eddie stood off stage, eyes wide, completely shocked. To him, that wasn't flattery. It was straight-up theft. He'd poured his heart and soul into creating something unique, and here was someone he'd once admired, turning it into a cheap copy. That moment shattered every bit of respect he had left for Rick. Backstage, Eddie's fury was impossible to hide. He told his team, "That's it, he's done." And just like that, Rick Derringer was officially out. No second chances, no apologies, just a fast exit from the tour. Backstage after the show, Eddie didn't hold back for a second. He went straight up to Rick Derringer, eyes burning, voice sharp, and made it clear nobody steals his sound and walks away like nothing happened. Word spread through the crew within minutes. Rick Derringer was out. Just like that, Eddie had him cut from the lineup. No questions, no discussion. Eddie had been watching every move from the side of the stage, and the look on his face said it all. He wasn't honored, he was furious. What could have been taken as a tribute felt like a slap to the face. To him, it wasn't a nod of respect, it was straight-up theft. After the show, Eddie kept it real. He pulled Rick aside and told him flat out, "I don't care if people use tapping, but copying my melody? That's different." He even reminded Rick that he'd once looked up to him as a kid, hoping that memory might hit a nerve and remind him what respect actually meant. But Rick just brushed it off like it was nothing. He mumbled something like, "Just giving the crowd what they liked," then turned his back and walked off without another word. That arrogance cut deep. Eddie had tried to stay cool, tried to handle it like a pro, but the very next night, Derringer pushed it from bad to downright disrespectful. When it was his turn to take the stage, Derringer pulled the same move again, same melody, same phrasing, same finish, and this time he took it even further. Just to twist the knife, he ended his set with "You Really Got Me," the Van Halen anthem that Eddie and the guys had already made legendary. The crowd went wild, but Eddie, he was done. That was it, the final straw. He didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't waste a breath. Eddie just made the call. Calm, cold, final. He told the crew straight, "Derringer's not opening for us anymore." No debate, no warnings, no second chances. Rick had crossed the line once and then doubled down with a smirk. Eddie shut that door and locked it for good. That decision sealed Rick Derringer's name on Eddie's secret blacklist forever. Because for Eddie, music wasn't just about killer solos or mind-blowing riffs. It was about respect. It was about heart and honesty. And once someone threw that respect out the window, there was no going back. So now that all 6 names on Eddie Van Halen's hidden blacklist are out in the open, Eric Clapton, Richie Blackmore, Joe Perry, Randy Rhoads, Tom Scholz, and Rick Derringer, which one shocks you the most? These weren't random names. These were idols, legends he once looked up to, but somewhere between admiration and betrayal, each of them crossed a line Eddie could never forgive. Eddie Van Halen might have been the happiest guitar hero on stage, the smiling lightning bolt who lit up every arena, but behind the amps, behind that iconic grin, lived a man carrying quiet scars. Each name on that secret list, Clapton, Blackmore, Perry, Rhoads, Scholz, and Derringer, told a story of heartbreak, disappointment, and hard lessons learned. These weren't feuds born from jealousy or chaos. They were heartbreaks from heroes he'd once admired, men he thought understood him, only to find out they didn't respect him the same way. People always saw Eddie as unstoppable, the joyful rock god who turned guitars into thunder and pure magic. But even legends bleed behind the spotlight. Every cold stare, every cutting remark, every stolen riff chipped away at that carefree spark he showed the world. He never went on camera to trash anyone or stir up drama. Eddie wasn't about that life. Instead, he poured everything into his guitar, turning pain into pure fire, heartbreak into history. Every note he played told his story louder than any headline ever could. And that's the wildest part. While others got caught up in industry politics and ego battles, Eddie stayed true to one thing, his passion for music. He didn't need revenge or fame games. Every time he hit that stage, he was basically saying, "You can copy my style, but you'll never play it like me." And he was right. Nobody ever did. Even with those 6 names still echoing in the back of his mind, Eddie refused to let hate define him. He grew from it. He kept reinventing himself, pushing the limits of what a guitar could do, faster, louder, more emotional than ever before. Every solo after those betrayals carried something deeper, a mix of fire, heart, and truth. That was Eddie's ultimate revenge, turning pain into raw power. Years later, close friends revealed something that might surprise fans. Eddie never stopped loving the music of the guys who hurt him. He still played their songs sometimes, still respected their talent. But he never forgot the moments that showed him just how cold the music world could be. Those memories became his lessons, carved deep into his soul. They reminded him to stay grounded, to stay humble, and most of all, to never lose that joy that made him shine from the very beginning. So when people bring up Eddie's secret blacklist, they're not just gossiping about grudges. They're talking about the human side of a legend. Eddie wasn't just a guitar hero. He was a man who felt every note, every betrayal, every ounce of love and heartbreak that life threw at him. And through it all, he kept smiling, that same grin that inspired millions around the world. Eddie Van Halen's story isn't really about who wronged him. It's about how he rose above it. His music outlasted every feud, every cold stare, and every rumor that tried to drag him down. He didn't need to talk trash or tear anyone apart. His guitar said everything for him. So now it's your turn. What do you think? Which story from Eddie's secret blacklist hit you the hardest? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. Smash that like button if you love a deep dive into rock's untold stories, and don't forget to subscribe for more wild legends, behind-the-scenes drama, and explosive music history. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video. Rock on!